Have you ever wondered when you're making or building a world how you're going to introduce new cultures and set up the interrelationship between those cultures? In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at cultures, where to beg, where to borrow, where to steal, the concepts and ideas that are going to go into your world building. I'm Rich Mayo, and this is Mach 1 Games, and I'm really glad you've joined me for this talk about cultures. On my last video, one of the comments that came up was, well, you can use the Romans as a paradigm for an expansive culture, and this is an interesting concept, but it gets to only one of the ways in which you can use culture in a role-playing settings. Now, a lot of times people don't think rationally about this, surprise, surprise, and some things that are done, if not done well, can become a real detriment when you're reading or experience something, because things then seem out of place or shoehorned in, or some kind of semi-objectionable cultural stereotype or bias. And literature and stories run the gamut of these things. Now, off the bat, you need to understand, or I need to make the case, that you cannot make any kind of fantasy but from the bones of reality, but from the bones of our shared experience. All language, all culture is appropriation, is a mixing. The words that we use have a history, they have a place, and they themselves aren't things. I can say that this is a chair upon which I sit, but the word chair is not the thing. It evokes the image, and then I have to refine the curl of the wood, the padding of the cushion, in order to modify by approximation the image that comes into mind when I say the word chair. Writing and storytelling is like this. We need to use metaphor and cultures as an approximation until we boil down. Let's take, for example, one of my favorite authors, Guy Gavriel Kay. Now, his approach to world building is to take something that seems like it's part of our history, a moment or place in our time, and then perform a quarter twist towards the fantastic and modify it. The language, the culture, the history, the people are all present along with all the cultures and people around them that shaped it. And then we're just performing a slight bit of legerdemain to come up with the world that we're presented with. The advantage of this approach is that it's very visceral. The details seem right. It can be immersive because we can believe it. We've been there before, and everything hangs together really well. This is only one of the approaches to inserting culture into your world, but it's limiting. At the face of it, if you start making more than that quarter twist, more than that little adjustment, you begin to introduce elements that would have a cascading effect on other things. So I've seen this play out. I was reading a post-apocalyptic fantasy novel, yet the religion and the culture and the motifs that emerged were very much Norse Viking migration era inspired, with all the gods and goddesses of the Norse pantheon, and it just seemed such a facile understanding of how intimately connected the Norse culture was to the time, to the place, to the climate and the culture. There's a teleology and an explanation of why things emerge at certain points, and to me it became very jarring that this real world thing that I knew was superimposed probably where it didn't belong, and it didn't make sense how this arose. I mean, if you interpret that the Norse gods were real and that's why they came back, it calls into question our own history, because we know that it's a much more complicated answer. Going back, all the pegs don't line up for that set of reasoning. So that's the first approach, is to take our world and just perform a modification. Now, obviously, all of these approaches can be intermixed and intermingled, and there's no absolute one way. The other another method is the metaphor method, so that you remember what I said about the chair. If you use a metaphor, like for instance Joss Whedon's Firefly series, where the frontier is the metaphor. The power of a metaphor is it brings a whole group, a whole dynamic of ideas together at once. It becomes a shorthand. So if I'm describing a chair, I don't need to describe the four legs, the back, and the seat. I can just say the word chair, put it into the background, and then you as the reader, the experiencer, you're going to know all the sort of things that come with the chair. And then what I do using that metaphor is then I make my message over top. So it's a way of juxtaposing, it's a way of putting side by side what I'm wanting to talk about and giving me a shorthand for talking about it quickly without bogging you down in the details of everything. Now, the next approach that you're going to see is what I call the first principles approach. You've got your Dave Duncans, Brandon Sanderson is good for creating a first principle world. The advantage of a first principle world is it says, right, I'm going to identify these cultural things. I'm identifying this mountain range, I'm identifying this river, I'm identifying this piece of history, and I'm identifying this type of magic. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to extrapolate based on what I know a culture around that. Now, that's seems like a good logical approach. Oh, look, Rich, we've stumbled on the best way of doing things. The problem, or like Brother Peter always complains when I use the phrase, the problem is. The problem with this approach in this circumstance for what I'm talking about is that it never has the richness of either the metaphor method or the cultural twist method, because the reader can't infer and supply some of their own experiences onto that. That shorthand is there missing. So first principles is sometimes not as immersive as the other things. So you want to be able, if you're going to do some first person or first principle immersion and figure out, well, why does this work from here, then you're probably going to want a little bit of the other approaches too. And the last approach I'm going to talk about comes back to the beginning, where I take events. George Martin is famous for this. He will create a world that is similar, has some of the political similarities to times in history, and he'll see some of the big events that came out, some of the dramatic events, his red wedding from the black wedding. These are lifting and taking inspiration from the history around us. I think is very important. It keeps the writer on the right track. And as a raving moderate, I tend to think that a blending of these approach gives you the sort of elegant pastiche of a world that could be, and with the right moderation, things fit. They're in proportion with what they, where they would come from, and it allows you to borrow from the right cultures. Now, just as an aside, I also thought it was interesting when, in response to my video about, well, how do I build a world, and I talked about building up the geography of it. Ian commented, oh, you could use the Romans for inspiration, when I'd already taken a society the same size as the Romans, the same scope geographically as the Romans, and if you want the two-river society that I borrowed some ideas from, it would be the Han Dynasty in China. I always found it really interesting, or not always, because I didn't learn very much about the Han Dynasty until after I was long out of school. And then I started questioning, well, why didn't I know much about them? Because they're really cool. I love the way that the philosophy, the art, the officials, there was a lot of interest. And then we have our back to our two rivers, right? The northern and the southern river in their case, and the eastern and western river in my case. But the Han Dynasty is absolutely fascinating, and I always imagine what it would have been like to be in one of those places, maybe in Syria or India, between these two, the Roman Empire on your left and the Han Dynasty on your right, and they don't seem to know much about each other, but you trade with both. I mean, that's a really interesting, talk about stuck between, and these aren't societies that were flash in the pan. This was centuries of these great civilizations growing up as these two giant pillars. So anyhow, that was what I wanted to talk about with cultures. So if you're building a fantasy world and you're including cultures, some of the pitfalls that I hope this video illuminates may be that you want to be careful to not make assumptions. One of the easiest things that you can do is try to bolt in something, but remember that thing has a context, and words have context. I can even find it slightly jarring when somebody uses a word like bedlam or decimate when we're inside of a fantasy world, or mesmerized. Well, Mr. Mesmer was a magician in the 1800s, and Bedlam was a mental institution, And decimate, unfortunately, has two meanings. It has the ancient meaning of the Roman practice of killing 1 in 10, and it has the modern meaning, which is eliminate the majority of, or cause complete collapse, almost by implication, reduce by 10, right? By a factor of 10, not reduced by a factor of 1 in 10. The math is sort of inverted because to our ears without that history. So language that we use when we're talking about these things, and this tends to be when we're naming people and places and things, it can be a metaphor. It can bring some things in, but be careful what you bring in. Be careful what you do, and just have a sense on how it's going to sound to the ear. Nerds tend to be fairly well read, so you can't simply throw out a word and expect that the etymology of that word is completely lost on everyone. Those words have meaning, and they bring with them. It's not just a chair. That concept comes forward. So you can't say the word decimate without that concept coming forward. You can't say bedlam without the institution coming forward. It's not just, I see some people, they treat the words in the dictionary as just a meaning. Well, no, it has there's a culture behind it. I got a word of the day, satori, in my inbox. I guess it's come into the English lexicon through Japanese, and they defined it as something like a flash of insight or inspiration. But the whole concept of satori is so much different and deeper than that. It's not like that definition's wrong. Don't get me on that. It's just sometimes things mean more than what you can say in a moment. And so be careful when you import those things, because you're bringing those things into your story. So be careful. You're bringing those things into your world. Be careful. Carefully put those things in. Understand how they relate one to another. The great American cowboy era doesn't have a lot of context if you don't have the indigenous people. That interrelation is absolutely essential for understanding what that moment in history meant. If you don't have that indigenous influence, that and all the problems and horrors and things that come from what came from that, you don't have the same experience. You can't just bring in half, and I think that's what I'm trying to warn people about. It's hard to bring in half a culture, and it's hard to bring in half a culture without context. So while it can be simple and easy just to think that you can pick something up from one place to another, but these are liquids. They take shape from the world around them. So, yeah, take care. Be careful. And go out and enjoy the worlds, the fantasy, the imagination of other writers, and see who does what well, who does things that you like. And then when you return to your own world building, hopefully you've got a little bit of the care and fear. Now, mind you, you can never get it perfect. Remember, life is metaphor. We just have to tell the stories and trust people to bridge over the gaps in logic. But let's not make them chasms of logic. Let's be as kind to the reader as we can. that's enough for now. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to the next one.